German idealism. From the tradition of modern thought, from Descartes and Spinoza to Kant, the idealist inherent the autonomous rationalist position of philosophical rationality in the face of the problems of religious consciousness and theological discourse. Unlike their predecessors, however, they will overcome the strict subdivision of the spheres of knowledge to enter the various fields discourse and to grasp the peculiar relationship that the consequence maintains there with itself. Theological discourse is, therefore, integrated into the set of concerns concerning the realization of freedom. As such, this discourse will give rise to a true reshaping of understanding, to be able to question and integrate the logic proper to theology, and, in particular, its rooting in a revelation that will be a mode of immediate contact chosen by the absolute itself in history. Christian has concentrated on the theme of revelation, more to find a new epistemological justification for it than to disqualify it in the manner of the Aufklärer, that is, the Enlightenment thinkers. The purpose of this new epistemological justification is the autonomy of knowledge and, therefore, to free oneself from the model of analogy, which tended to provide the key to knowledge in general in the order of finite substances. The evolution of philosophical methods around the problem of revelation will thus be studied, in order to be able to situate, on the ground itself, the interest and also the fruitfulness of this philosophical instance, and for fundamental theology. Fichte. Although he never ceased to call for the overcoming of the external forms of religion, Fichte nevertheless, with his speculative appreciation of Christianity, evolved considerably, giving to the ethical scope, which he already recognized in his sermons, unexpected developments thanks to the transformation of his method. Without a doubt, at the beginning it seemed more urgent to him, following Kant's example, to complete the liberation of the spirit from religious formalism, to restore it to its moral destiny, that is, to the realization of its rational autonomy, rather than to ask directly about the relevance of religious discourse in the context of his philosophy of action. For the young Fichte, religion is acceptable only within the limits of a well-defined moral project and revelation from which it derives. Authority is of no interest except from a practical point of view, since it derogates from the laws of the transcendental field of consciousness. The only admissible criterion is the action prompted by religion within the framework of the free moral action of the will. If context, the supersensible justification of our action is lost, we acquire the certainty that only the moral effort of freedom can be a true help in concrete life, and that we can and intend to achieve poorly. The idea of a supernatural replacement for our moral failings is a serious illusion that leads directly to all the moral deviations that religion can give rise to, when it tries to elevate the action of certain men above the law, because such action respond to supernatural principles. Religion, properly understood, is not opposed to morality. It seeks only to make man better, to act on his heart, to favor his decision in favor of moral progress. Religion has the function of secretly preparing the kingdom of mortality, and faith in the possibility that man has of surpassing himself, of improving himself, of elevating himself to good. At this level lies the concept of revelation, which carries the strongest charge of ambiguity, since it always runs the risk of dragging reflection towards the establishment of an order superior to morality, whose interference in concrete experience contradicts the elementary laws of freedom. But believing itself exempt from moral order, freedom loses the self-determination that, in fact, characterizes its relationship of obedience to the duty it has proposed. The institution of a supernatural order reduces free beings to simple, irresponsible actors in a drama that escapes them, and whose superior interests become temporal ends that are truly within their reach. True religion, on the contrary, frees us from the illusion of a superior, pre-existing order, of a divine plan already established, to convert hearts to produce concrete acts, to exercise responsibility, to commit ourselves to earthly structures. Religion should not lead us to guide the interference between the real and the ideal, where knowledge and action are articuled. Concrete effort is a more or less successful the ideal and the project structures of reason that guarantees reflection on a real that is always problematic, on an approximate reflection. The spirit cell determines and limits itself according to its ideal, absolute constitution, It is the original act of freedom, that is ertat, eternal love, ultimately. What matters is only this mystics of action that considers the manifestation of love in the most unexpected forms. Without a doubt, the philosophy of action founded on duty of 1994-95 remains valid. We could not say the same about the theory of creative morality. The reflection for the establishment, whose interference in concrete experience contradicts the elementary laws of freedom. But, believing itself exempt from the moral order, freedom for that very reason loses the self-determination that in fact characterizes its relationship of obedience to the duty that it proposed. The institution of a supernatural order reduces free beings to the condition of simple, irresponsible actors in a drama that escapes, then, and whose superior interests begin to replace the temporal ends that are really within your reach. True religion, on the contrary, frees us from the illusion of a pre-existing superior order of a divine plan already pre-established, to context hearts to produce concrete acts, to experience their responsibility, to commit themselves to earthly structures. Religion should not lead us to accept our essential dependence on ourselves, the fragility of our moral effort. In 1789 and 1799, these radical positions, in favor of a religion enclosed in the human heart, at the source of moral effort and subject to the moral progress implied by it, provoked a violent reaction on the part of religious intellectual circles against Fichte's philosophy, leading to the famous episode of the atheism mustrite, that is, the dispute over atheism. Fichte was never able to eliminate the suspicions against his philosophy of that time, to the point that the transformation of his philosophical method went completely unnoticed in the eyes of his detractors, and, a fortiori, the same would occur with regard to the scope of his transformation with regard to the concept of religion. The break with Schelling in 1806 is a fine example of the complete contempt that casts a well over Fichte's entire work from 1798 onwards. His new philosophy wants to think from the eternal essence, that is, from the absolute ideality that constitutes the field of consciousness, the origin and intensive and no longer extensive dynamism of knowledge thinking according to the eternal essence, as a regulating notion, no longer makes sense. It is necessary to think from it, and to receive oneself as a particle of this infinite love, of this unblemished happiness, at the critical point of the manifestation of love in the most unexpected forms. Without a doubt, the philosophy of action founded on duty of 1794-95 remains valid. We could not say the same of the creative moral theory, just as action is never abandoned. It is rather contemplation that is added to it and that deeply vivifies it. Here we find one of the justification for the formulas, at once religious and active, that Fichte uses in the discourses to the German nation to characterize life and existence. But Fichte's representation of action, which completely isolated the latter to the exacerbated tension of finite morality, which discovers, as in its inverse, through distortion or negation, the absolute that justifies it, but from which it can expect nothing, since this would mean by mixing it with interest, preventing the rational affirmation of the postulated notion of practical reason. Now it is the manifestation of love that is important. Consequently, it is necessary to prepare consciousness to appropriate its position of its task of being a reflection within concrete experience, internal and external, ethical and political. The problem is to participate in this metamorphosis of love into being. This participation consists in reflecting the action of the absolute in us, that is, in the correlation of the idealization of the ideal from the limiting, which defines the activity of our freedom the world, committed to investing ways of affirming its virtuality. Participating in love therefore consists in the Wohlert, in returning as intimately as possible the action and thought of one's own freedom, to the point of progressively identifying oneself with the love and finiteness of oneself, which is full coincidence with oneself, flat assumption of oneself, joy or happiness of being in oneself, self-possession of the self by oneself. This attempt by Fichte to raise the level of theological aesthetics to the religious ideology of his philosophy leaves many problems about the historical fact of revelation in suspense. It is clear that Fichte maintains, from Rhe Gospel above all, the Johannine speculations about the eternal word and the metaphysics of clarity, deducible from which is also found in the Pauline epistles and in the Synodics. In the preaching of the kingdom, our time only has meaning in terms of its ordaining to the kingdom that is realized in it, to the eternal, to absolute freedom, incarnated in the person of Christ. Is the essence of Christianity at stake here, the deviation of the kerygma towards a speculative gospel, in the manner of lacing? It is thought that fundamentally it a question of a first theology linked to an absolute philosophy of freedom, a foundation that, in some way, leaves open the possibility of a religious or ethical construction, in the manner of Rahner's theological anthropology. Fichte's philosophical discourse does not intend to overcome the gap that separates the relative self-understanding of the absolute in history from the astonishing kenosis of the word, contemplated in the singular commitment to an ethical destiny. It would almost require a hermeneutical inversion that, for Fichte, is outside the field of the legitimacy of philosophical rationality in its historical concreteness, remaining the competence of science, which makes it its positive principle. Philosophy is at the 0 point of religious experience, and, although it does not contradict it, does not replace it, much less supplant it, it but proposes critical freedom, the meaning to be given to the value, for human destiny, of this confrontation with the absolute that in any case effectively presides over such destiny, tending towards the seance of the negative realm of opposition or dualism, to elevate it to the spirit of the whole, which underlines all our negations. Contrary to what Hippolyte suggests, or that is, the introduction to Hegel's Hello So High, the positivity of Christianity does not reside in the event Jesus Christ. As such, in this singularity rend and read to the universality of meaning, Christian revelation draws its positivity from the rupture with the order of representation. This is thought of in the sense 0f its positivity. Outside the precepts and truths of the Catholicism, it becomes clear that it does not oppose anything to conscience, that it does not impose anything strange or arbitrary on it, but that, on the contrary, it is, in the depths of such conscience, as if the interior manifestation of its own, belonging to the divine in him, in Fichte, to the divine environment. It is communion of harmony of the threatened existence with the depths of his being, with the non-existence of difference, according to the term G. Jarkovic. The true revelation of Christ to Peter in the Gospel of Mark, Mk. 8:29 could be commented thus: the divine that is in recognized me, as divine you understood my essence, it resonated in yours. The revelation does not reside in the evidence of an exteriority, because those who saw and touched Jesus rejected him or were content to believe in him, without yet being truly born into the truth, becoming worshippers in spirit, children of the light that dwells in them, thus being reborn a second time, uniting themselves to the life of the whole like the branches to the throne of the vine.